My name is Emily, and if you took a quick look at my life, you'd probably think it was picture perfect. I was married to James, a successful architect who had always been my anchor. Our home was the one place where I truly felt safe and at ease. James and I met when I was in my 30s, and from the moment we connected, I've been surrounded by his love and care. But there was one thing that occasionally cast a shadow over our happiness: the relationship with his son Ryan from his first marriage. Ryan was a teenager with a challenging personality, and he always kept a certain distance, especially from me. Ryan's mother passed away when he was just a child, and it left a deep scar on him. James often reassured me that Ryan just needed time to adjust to me, and I tried to be patient. But as the years passed, our relationship didn't get any easier. Ryan remained distant and aloof, and I struggled to find a way to connect with him. Our evenings at home were often filled with an uncomfortable silence. James worked late most nights, and Ryan would retreat to his room, barely speaking a word to me. There were times when I tried to engage him, offering help with his schoolwork or just making small talk, but he'd always respond with short, detached answers, avoiding any real conversation. I could feel our home, which should have been warm and inviting, slowly turning cold and empty. One evening, while James was working late yet again, Ryan came home later than usual. I was sitting in the kitchen with a cup of tea, listening as he dropped his backpack by the door and headed straight to his room. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I couldn't bear the tense silence and the growing distance between us any longer. I got up from the table and walked to his room. I knocked, but the response was the same as always, and indifferent. "Come in." I opened the door to find Ryan sitting at his desk, engrossed in his computer. He didn't even glance in my direction. "Ryan," I began, doing my best to keep my voice steady. "We need to talk." He didn't take his eyes off the screen, which only heightened my anxiety. The tension between us was palpable, and I knew if we didn't address it now, the consequences could be serious. "About what?" he replied coldly, finally turning to look at me. I wanted to tell him how difficult it was for me to feel like an outsider in my own home, how hard I'd tried but couldn't find a way to reach him. But the words got stuck in my throat. All I could manage was a soft, "I feel like we're drifting apart." "We were never close," Ryan replied bluntly, and there was a hint of pain in his voice that he was trying to mask. His words hit me harder than I expected. I knew our relationship had always been strained, but I didn't realize he felt it so deeply. A mix of emotions surged inside me. Part of me wanted to shout, to make him see that I genuinely cared. But I also knew that pushing too hard could make things worse. "I just want you to know that I'm here for you. If you ever want to talk, or if something's bothering you, I'm always ready to listen," I finally said. Ryan just nodded, still not looking at me, and turned back to his computer. I knew the conversation was over for the night. As I closed the door behind me, a heavy feeling settled in my chest. Nothing had changed, but I hoped that maybe, just maybe, it was a small step in the right direction. That night, I lay awake for hours, replaying our conversation in my mind. I knew the issues between us wouldn't be resolved in a single evening, but deep down, I still held on to the hope that I could find a way to reach Ryan's heart, even if it took time and patience. The next morning, I woke up with a lingering heaviness in my chest. My conversation with Ryan the previous day had left me feeling conflicted. On one hand, I knew it was a necessary step, but on the other, I realized just how deeply we were both caught up in our emotions. I understood that not everything could be mended so easily, and that only made it more difficult. James had risen early as usual, and was already getting ready for work when I walked into the kitchen. His face showed signs of weariness, but he still managed to give me a small smile. "Good morning, Emily," he said, placing his coffee cup on the table. "How did you sleep?" I shrugged, trying to mask my unease. He was always so caring and attentive, but I didn't want to burden him with my worries. After all, he had plenty on his plate at work. "I slept fine," I replied, trying to sound upbeat. "How about you?" "About the same," he sighed, pausing for a moment as if he wanted to say something more, but then seemed to change his mind. Instead, he added, "Emily, I have an important meeting today. I might not be home until late tonight." I nodded, knowing this was typical for his work schedule, but something about the way he said it made me uneasy. "Is everything okay?" I asked, picking up on his hesitation. James gave me a slight smile, but I could tell there was more beneath the surface. Don't worry, it's just work. I might have to make an important decision soon. I didn't press further, even though a sense of unease settled in my stomach. After breakfast, James said a quick goodbye and left, leaving me alone with my thoughts. I knew his job was demanding and stressful, but today felt different. The day dragged on, and I tried to busy myself with the usual household chores to keep my mind off things. Ryan stayed holed up in his room, seemingly oblivious to my presence. I found myself lingering by his door a few times, but I couldn't bring myself to try and start another conversation. It felt like there was an invisible wall between us, one that wouldn't easily come down. That evening, James returned home later than usual. He looked exhausted, but there was a determined look in his eyes. I set dinner on the table and we ate in silence. Ryan didn't come out of his room, and that familiar, oppressive emptiness settled over me again. Finally, James put down his fork and looked at me intently. "Emily, we need to talk," he began. And I realized that he'd been holding something back all day. At today's meeting, I was given an offer I can't refuse. My heart started to race. I knew James was one of the top architects at his firm, and such offers didn't come his way often. But the serious tone in his voice made me uneasy. "What kind of offer?" I asked cautiously. "They want me to lead a new project in another city. It's a huge opportunity for me, one that could open a lot of doors for us." I felt frozen as I processed his words. This meant he'd have to leave, possibly for weeks or even months. I knew how much his career meant to him, and I didn't want to be selfish, but the thought of being alone with Ryan for that long filled me with dread. "How long?" I asked quietly, not wanting to hear the answer. "A couple of months, maybe more," James replied. "But it's temporary, Emily. I know it'll be tough, but I believe you can handle it. We have to think about our future." I tried to keep my composure, but inside I was churning. The idea of being alone with Ryan, when our relationship was already so strained, seemed overwhelming. But I also knew this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for James, and I couldn't be the one to hold him back. "Of course I can handle it," I finally said, doing my best to hide my true feelings. "It's not forever, right?" James took my hand and gave it a reassuring squeeze. "No, it's not forever. We can get through this. I believe in us." His words were meant to comfort me, but instead, they left me with an uneasy feeling. I knew tough times were ahead, and while I wanted to believe we could get through it, a part of me wasn't so sure. But I had to stay strong for James, for our family. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about how I would manage with Ryan now that James was gone. Our relationship was already so strained, and I worried that being apart would only make things worse. But deep down, a small part of me held on to the hope that maybe this would be an opportunity for change. Because sometimes, it's through challenges that we discover new strengths within ourselves. I didn't know what the future held, but I was determined to give it my best shot. A week had passed since James had left, and the house, once filled with his comforting presence, now felt empty and unwelcoming. Anxiety gnawed at me, and I could feel the situation slipping further out of my control. Each day spent with Ryan became more of a challenge, and the tension between us only seemed to grow. Ryan was clearly affected by his father's absence, but he didn't show it in any obvious way. Instead, he became even more withdrawn, rarely leaving his room and barely speaking to me. Every time I tried to reach out, he either ignored me or responded in a way that quickly shut down any conversation. It felt like the walls between us were getting higher and more impenetrable, and I had no idea how to break through them. One afternoon, when I returned home from work, I noticed something different in the house. A pair of sneakers that didn't belong to Ryan were lying in the hallway, and I could hear muffled voices coming from his room. It was the first time Ryan had ever invited someone over, and it immediately put me on edge. I walked up to his door and knocked, but there was no response. After knocking again, I finally heard an irritated, "What? Ryan, can I talk to you for a minute?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm and not show my concern. "We're busy," he replied curtly. I stood there, feeling unwelcome and completely helpless. It was clear he didn't want me to intrude, but I needed to know what was going on. Taking a deep breath, I decided to step inside. When I opened the door, I was greeted by a scene I hadn't expected. Several of his friends were sitting on the floor, surrounded by empty beer cans and snack wrappers. Ryan, seeing me, immediately got up and walked over, closing the door behind him as if to shield his friends from my presence. "I told you we were busy," he said, his voice laced with irritation. "Ryan, I need to know what's going on here," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "You should have let me know you were having guests." "Are you keeping tabs on me now?" he snapped. "Who I hang out with is my business. I'm not trying to control you, Ryan, but this is our home. You need to respect the house rules," I said, struggling to remain calm though inside I was seething. The situation was spiraling out of control, and I didn't know how to reel it back in. "Your rules," he corrected, his voice dripping with disdain. "And I'm not going to follow them." His words cut deep like a knife to my heart. A wave of resentment and anger surged within me. But I knew that if I let my emotions take over now, it would only make things worse. "Ryan, please, I don't want to argue." I tried to find some middle ground. "We all live here, and we need to consider each other. Maybe you could just explain what's going on." "Nothing serious," he shot back, clearly not interested in continuing the conversation. "We're just hanging out." I realized this wasn't the time to push things further. I felt like an outsider in my own home, like I was trespassing on someone else's territory. There was a coldness in his eyes that I knew words wouldn't melt. "Okay," I said, backing down. "But let's agree that next time you'll let me know if you're having friends over, and please keep the noise down." "Sure," he replied with a tone thick with sarcasm, but I decided to let it go. I quietly closed the door and headed back to the kitchen, my hands trembling from the encounter. This small episode, which might seem trivial to others, became a glaring red flag for me. I realized that Ryan was slipping further away, and if I didn't find a way to reach him soon, things could spiral out of control. That night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind raced with questions that wouldn't let me rest. How could I turn things around? What could I do to regain Ryan's trust? Or had I already lost it for good? With each passing day, my worries only grew. Ryan continued to act distant, and his indifference started to chip away at my inner peace. I was hesitant to admit it, but I felt like I was beginning to lose my grip, not just on the situation but on myself as well. A few evenings later, after the incident with his friends, Ryan suddenly emerged from his room, threw on a jacket, and headed for the door. This was out of character for him, and I couldn't ignore it. "Ryan, where are you going?" "It's late," I asked, feeling a knot of anxiety tighten in my chest. He paused briefly but didn't even bother to turn around. "None of your business, Emily," he replied coldly, preparing to leave. A wave of panic washed over me. I knew something was happening, and I needed to act fast. "Wait," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Let's talk. I want to understand what's going on with you." Ryan finally turned around, and in his eyes I saw not just anger but pain. For a moment he seemed to hesitate, but then he quietly said, "You'll never understand." With those words he walked out the door, leaving me standing there feeling helpless. I knew I couldn't keep putting off this conversation. We couldn't leave things as they were. It could lead to consequences we couldn't undo. When Ryan came back late that night, I knew I couldn't just sit by any longer. Summoning all my courage, I approached him and asked if we could talk. This time he didn't resist, and we made our way to the kitchen. "I know this is tough for you," I began, doing my best to keep my voice calm. "I'm not trying to replace your mom. I just want to be there for you, to support you." Ryan was silent for a long time before he finally spoke. "I can't accept it. Everything feels wrong." His words were laced with pain, but I sensed something else beneath them. Maybe a glimmer of hope for understanding. "Let's try to change that," I suggested gently. "We can start by being open with each other." He nodded, and I saw a flicker of agreement in his eyes. It was a small step but an important one. I knew we still had a long road ahead of us, but in that moment hope began to take root. After that evening, when Ryan finally allowed himself to open up, even just a little, something shifted, small but meaningful. We started crossing paths more often in the house, and I made a conscious effort to be attentive to his mood, not pushing too hard but not pulling away either. I knew it was too early to declare victory, but I was thankful for this tiny bit of progress. A few days later, Ryan approached me in the kitchen, completely out of the blue. caught me off guard because he usually kept his distance. I was in the middle of making dinner when he suddenly offered to help. "I can chop the vegetables," he said briefly, avoiding direct eye contact. I was surprised but tried not to show it. "Sure, that would be great," I replied, handing him a knife and a cutting board. We worked side by side in silence, but this silence was different, not heavy but rather soothing. I decided not to disrupt the moment by bringing up any of our issues. Instead, we focused on the simple task at hand. It seemed like Ryan found some peace in that. After dinner, Ryan lingered in the kitchen longer than usual. Mustering up some courage, I asked, "How's everything going? School? Friends?" He hesitated for a moment before responding, "It's fine. School is the same. Friends? Well, it's complicated." His words made me a bit uneasy, but I didn't push him. "If you ever want to talk about it, I'm here," I offered, trying to convey sincerity. Ryan fell silent again, as if weighing my words, and then finally said, "Yeah, maybe later. It's just a lot to handle right now." It was another small step toward trust, and I felt a bit of the weight lift from my heart. We were still far from perfect, but for the first time in a long while I saw a glimmer of hope. Later that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard a soft knock on my door. Sitting up in surprise, I watched as Ryan cautiously entered the room. "Emily," he began quietly, his voice tinged with doubt, "I just wanted to say thank you for not pressuring me and for giving me space." I felt a flutter in my chest. Those simple yet heartfelt words meant more to me than he could ever know. "Ryan, I'm always here for you," I replied gently. "We'll get through this step by step." He nodded and left, leaving me with the thought that this brief exchange was a significant milestone. We both knew there would still be challenges ahead, but in that moment, I felt like I had finally found a way into his heart. Lying there in the darkness, a smile spread across my face as I realized we now had a real chance. A chance to become a true family. The evening turned out to be peaceful and calm. Ryan and I slowly started to find common ground, and it gave me hope for the future. We began spending more time together, and our conversations grew more open and honest. One evening, out of the blue, Ryan suggested, "Emily, how about we have dinner together tonight? I can cook something, and maybe we could have a little wine." His initiative surprised me. It was the first time Ryan had ever suggested doing something just for the two of us. To me, it felt like a huge step forward, a sign that he was beginning to accept me as a part of his life. "That sounds like a wonderful idea," I responded, trying to hide my excitement. "I can help you with the cooking." "No need, I'll handle everything myself," he said with a smile. I decided to trust him and let Ryan take charge of the evening. He prepared dinner, simple but made with care. Pasta with sauce and a fresh salad. We sat down at the table, poured a glass of wine, and began to talk. Ryan seemed relaxed, and I felt that a real connection was starting to form between us. We discussed all sorts of things: school, his friends, his plans for the future. I was overjoyed to see him so open and trusting. This evening felt like a symbol of our reconciliation, a step toward a new beginning. After dinner, we lingered at the table, chatting about the little things in life. Finally, feeling the weight of the day, I thanked Ryan for a wonderful evening and wished him good night. He nodded, and I went to bed with the comforting feeling that something genuine had finally developed between us. However, the peace of that night didn't last long. Around 3 a.m., I was startled awake by a soft knock on my door. Groggily opening my eyes, I saw Ryan standing in the doorway. His face was tense, and his eyes were filled with anxiety. "Ryan, what's wrong?" I asked, my heart tightening with concern. He silently stepped into the room, holding his phone in his hands. His fingers were trembling slightly. "Emily, I need to show you something," he said, and there was something in his voice that sent a chill down my spine. I sat up in bed, feeling a wave of unease wash over me. Ryan came closer and played a video on his phone. At first, it seemed like a normal video of us from earlier that evening, laughing and talking together. But then the scene changed, and I saw myself lying in bed, fast asleep. In that instant, I felt the blood drain from my face. "What is this?" I barely managed to say, feeling a shiver run through my entire body. Ryan looked away, clearly aware of the seriousness of the situation. I don't know what got into me," he muttered. "I didn't mean any harm. I wanted to make sure everything was okay." But I know it's wrong. I didn't know how to deal with what I was feeling. His words echoed in my mind. I couldn't believe that the same person I had shared such a warm evening with could do something like this. It was a violation of my privacy, a betrayal of the fragile trust we had been carefully building. Ryan, I began, doing my best to stay composed. Do you understand that this is not okay? This is tearing apart everything we've worked for. He nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I'm sorry, Emily. I wasn't thinking. I was scared. I don't know what came over me. I could see he was genuinely remorseful, but there were still consequences to his actions. A mix of hurt, anger, and deep disappointment welled up inside me. Ryan, we need to have a serious conversation about this, but now isn't the time, I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. We'll talk about it in the morning and figure out where to go from here. He nodded and quietly left the room, leaving me alone with my thoughts, swimming in confusion and broken trust. That night, sleep eluded me as I replayed the events of the evening in my mind. Everything that had seemed so promising and hopeful had suddenly become a source of deep pain and disappointment. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. Our relationship was once again teetering on the edge, and I would have to make some tough decisions about how to move forward. The next morning, after that strange and painful night, I got up and headed down to the kitchen. Ryan was already there, sitting at the table with his head bowed, his face a mixture of shame and worry. Gathering my strength, I walked over and sat down across from him. We need to talk, Ryan. I began, trying to keep my voice calm, even though I was boiling inside. He slowly lifted his head and looked at me, the same tension from last night still evident in his eyes. I know what I did was wrong, he began, struggling to find the right words. I can't explain what came over me. I was just overwhelmed with emotions. I don't even know how to put it into words. I studied him, trying to grasp what was going on in his mind. Maybe he truly didn't realize the impact of what he had done, but that didn't excuse his actions. Ryan, you broke my trust, I said, looking him square in the eye. This isn't just a mistake. It's an invasion of privacy. We were just starting to mend our relationship, and now I don't know how to move forward. He clenched his fists, his eyes welling up with unshed tears. I didn't want to destroy what we had, he muttered. I thought that if I could somehow control the situation, it would make things easier for me. I know it was wrong, and I'm asking for your forgiveness. A battle raged within me. On one hand, I could see that he was genuinely sorry, and part of me wanted to give him a chance to make things right. On the other hand, I was afraid that if I didn't stand firm now, this incident could be the beginning of the end. Forgiveness is important, but I can't just sweep this under the rug, I said after a pause. We both need time to process what happened, but I want you to understand that trust isn't something that can be rebuilt overnight. It's a process, and it can be long and difficult. Ryan nodded, not taking his eyes off me. I could see the hope in his eyes, the hope that things could be mended, and it made me relax just a bit. I'm willing to work on it, he said with determination in his voice. I want us to be able to trust each other again, and I'm ready to prove that I can do better. This felt like a turning point. I knew Ryan understood the gravity of his actions, and he genuinely wanted to make things right. But I also knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, and we'd both have to work hard to rebuild the bridges that had been broken. All right, Ryan, I replied gently. We'll work on this together. But you need to understand that trust isn't something you can rebuild with words alone. It's going to take actions, and I'll support you, but only if I see that you're truly committed to changing your behavior. He nodded, and for the first time in a long while, a cautious but genuine smile appeared on his face. We both understood that the journey ahead would be long, but this moment felt like an important step toward reclaiming what had almost been lost. We spent the day in relative silence, each of us absorbed in our own thoughts. Ryan was clearly making an effort to be more open and attentive, and I, in turn, was doing my best to foster an atmosphere of trust. We both knew there was still a lot of work to do, but we also knew that now we had a real chance to bridge the gap that had once seemed impossible to cross. When James returned home, the three of us gathered for a family dinner. The house felt cozy and warm again, but it was a different kind of warmth, more mature, shaped by the challenges we had faced together. James, ever attentive and caring, seemed even more engaged in his relationship with Ryan. He noticed something had changed, though it took him some time to realize just how profound that change was. One evening after dinner, Ryan suddenly suggested, "Dad, Emily, how about we go for a walk together? I know a place nearby where we can relax and talk." James and I exchanged surprised glances, but we readily agreed. This suggestion was another sign that Ryan was ready to build a new relationship, one founded on mutual trust and respect. We left the house and headed toward a small park just a few blocks away. The September evening was cool, the air filled with the faint scent of fallen leaves, and I could feel a sense of calm surrounding us. Ryan walked beside me, and for the first time in a long while, I saw him truly relaxed. As we reached a bench in the park, Ryan suddenly stopped and turned to face James and me. "I want to tell you both something," he began, and there was a firmness in his voice. "I know I've messed up a lot over the past few months, and I want you to know that I'm really sorry for that. I've spent a lot of time thinking about how things could have been different, and now I realize it's up to me to make sure things go right from here on out." James looked at his son with warmth, and I saw a smile spread across his face. "Ryan, we all make mistakes," he said softly. "What matters is not that you made a mistake, but that you're willing to fix it. We're proud of you for acknowledging it and working on it," I added. "Ryan, I want you to know that no matter what's happened, I'll always be here for you. We've been through a lot, and I believe that we can move forward, no matter how tough it gets." Ryan nodded, and I noticed how his eyes sparkled with emotions he was holding back. "Thank you both," he said quietly. "I know trust isn't something that can be rebuilt overnight, but I promise I'll do my best. I don't want to make the same mistakes again." We sat on the bench for a while, enjoying the peacefulness of the park and each other's company. For the first time in a long time, I felt like there was no longer any unspoken tension between us. We talked about the future, about Ryan's plans, about how he envisioned the next steps in his life. His honesty and sincerity moved me deeply. When we finally returned home, I felt a sense of peace within my soul. I knew our journey wasn't over yet, but now we had something that could truly be called a family. We had become closer, stronger, and wiser because of the challenges we had faced. That night, lying in bed, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for what we now had. The hardships had made us stronger, and despite all the worries, I knew we were ready to face whatever new challenges might come our way. We were on a new path, and I believed that this path would lead us to a bright and happy future.